As you've just read, today we're going to talk about protests in Palestine that are unseen in Western media. We're also going to discuss how the ones that are seen in Western media get portrayed and framed.
As a little disclaimer in the beginning, the purpose of this video is not to antagonize anyone, but to show how the media can create certain narratives through framing.
During our research, we've noticed that it can be quite tricky to talk about Palestine without also talking about Israel. And honestly, as Germans, that can put us in a pretty uncomfortable position. But we will get to that later. For now, we're just going to take a quick look at how protests in Palestine get discussed in German media and how they're being shown in the news.
Noch nie hat der Großraum Tel Aviv einen derart massiven Raketenbeschuss erlebt. Auch in der Nacht setzen radikal-islamische Palästinenser aus dem Gazastreifen ihre Angriffe fort. Die Menschen flüchten in Bunker und viele verbringen dort auch die Nacht. Der Süden Israels ist nach wie vor unter Beschuss. Die Hamas-Führung hat Vermittlungsversuchen aus dem Ausland eine Absage erteilt.
Am Tag des Bodens haben sich israelische Sicherheitskräfte und palästinensische Demonstranten an mehreren Orten Straßenschlachten geliefert. An einem Kontrollpunkt nördlich von Jerusalem gingen die Sicherheitskräfte gegen Demonstranten vor, die sich an einem Marsch auf Jerusalem beteiligten. Am Damaskustor zur Altstadt in Jerusalem trieb berittene Polizei mehrere Dutzend Demonstranten auseinander. Auch in Bethlehem kam es zu Zusammenstößen.
That video is just one example, but it's part of a pattern. When people in Germany hear about protests in Palestine, the images are usually dominated by violence. Violent clashes, demonstrations, demonstrators throwing stones, tear gas being thrown by authorities. Those are the things we usually see in the German news. These are all typical images. In May 2021 especially, news reports were dominated by these pictures of heavy violence, but they are only fragments of a much, much bigger picture.
As political scientist Kai Hafiz stated in a discussion paper about the West and Islam, conflicts like the Israeli-Palestinian one seem to swallow up the capacities of many global mass media because it is considered hard news. He explains, images and information about the politics and society of the other have remained highly selective and fragmented. They are mostly confined to politics, while other spheres of everyday life are underrepresented. This selectiveness can be explained using a variety of communication theories, such as framing theory. Framing is actually a set of theories that emerged from agenda-setting research, and it's such a broad, all-encompassing approach that it's been popular across multiple research disciplines since the 1970s. But the most used definition of framing is Robert Entman's conceptualization. Framing essentially involves selection and salience. To frame is to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text, in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and/or treatment recommendation for the item described.
Basically, frames can be understood as the way information is being presented or packaged. Something like an aid for interpreting information. This field of research also focuses on how certain parts of the news are being emphasized. These choices can also influence the opinions of people on the receiving end.
According to a study, the framing of the conflict, while primarily dominated by political frames in the past, now mainly consists of religious frames.
But there is another huge factor that influences the way the conflict gets discussed in German media. The perception of the past, especially of Nazism. The fact that Germany never wants this to happen again leads to a strong tendency of supporting Israel.
And of course, this trickles down into the way news from Palestine is reported on.
As a result, the conflict is often framed in a way that portrays Israel's violence as a justified reaction to Palestinian protests. These protests are often referred to as terrorism in German media. Another study about news in German TV concluded that Israel and its political actors have a much bigger representation than the Palestinian side does. The study also found that Israel is reported on when there are simple social occasions with no direct relevance to the conflict and/or acts of violence. This means that compared to Israel, a huge part of the Palestinian point of view remains unseen to German recipients. With this project, we kind of hope to explore a part of what's unseen. So we took a look at some online videos from protesters from Palestine. peaceful protest in Ramallah in May 2021 in support of Jerusalem. They describe their feelings as exploding volcanoes in their chests and say they want to live freely.
What do you think about the German media coverage regarding the Arab-Israeli conflict?
It's pathetic. It's simply pathetic. I'll give you a recent example. Deutsche Welle, the official international channel of Germany to the world. Germany rejects Amnesty's apartheid label for Israel. The Israeli regime is an apartheid regime because it discriminates not between Jew and Arab, in law between Jew and not Jew. In law. So in South Africa it was between white and not white, and in Israel the regime says in law Jew and not Jew. This is a crime against humanity. It's not an anti-Jewish label. There are people responsible for the Holocaust, and they should be brought to justice, not to vengeance, but to try and suppress criticism of the state of Israel as an apartheid state by ascribing collective guilt to the German people. I would use a rather strong and not academic word. It stinks.
What kind of recommendations you'd like to provide to the European media outlet coverages?
To do academic research on any subjects that has relationship to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to be careful to nourish and foster and further develop the critical facilities, and to tell the truth, and not to be intimidated, and definitely not to be intimidated by false allegations of anti-Semitism. Criticism of Israel as an apartheid state in Germany and beyond Germany, in Europe as a whole, is not anti-Semitism, is not anti-Jewish.
The problem for German journalists is that often at these peaceful demonstrations there can still be radical anti-Israeli slogans being shouted around. Even one of those can be enough to prevent German media from airing this kind of video material.
To get a better perspective on the way it works in the German news sector, we interviewed a Middle East expert from Germany who has worked as a correspondent in Palestine and Israel. They explained that reporting on Palestine is a very sensitive matter for German journalists, and to our point, our source asked not to be named for exactly this reason. Our source explains, because of Germany's history, German media go above and beyond to avoid accusations of anti-Semitism when a report includes a critical quote from a Palestinian, even if it is not necessarily radical. As defined by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, it is even considered anti-Semitic if the State of Israel, understood as a Jewish collective, is so much as criticized. The unfortunate consequence is this. A majority amount of journalists shy away from reporting on Palestine and Palestinian points of view in order to avoid being criticized in the German public sphere.
Our source also confirmed that due to sensitivities surrounding the matter, there isn't much reporting on Palestine in Germany in general. So people here in Germany don't really have a clue of what exactly is going on there. They also added that colleagues who still work as correspondents often struggle to get their stories and pitches about Palestine through to the German media sphere. The expert complained about the really low interest in German newsrooms about the topic as well. If a report is to be published, there has to be a specific connection to Germany, or at least 10 people must have died on the Palestinian side for it to be considered relevant news. Our source regretfully explained that that is often the requirement from the German side for news from Palestine. But the life of the Palestinians, the way they view the world, and their voices regarding their own oppression is often of very little interest to German media. So it is also not surprising that German media isn't really covering any peaceful protests at the very least, or any other parts of the Palestinian life that remain unseen for us as a German viewer.